So, what are your reflections on Climate Week so far?
Yeah, thanks, Louis, and thanks for having me here. Overall, it's been really energizing. I think that someone used the word paradox to me the other day around Climate Week, which I think is a good one for this year, where there's more events registered through the climate group this year. There is just really a good energy in all these different events, but at the same time, there's obviously both in our physical and political environment, there are challenges that we're facing, and so overall, it's been good. I think from the perspective and obviously preaching to the choir of your audience here on
Mhm.
climate proof, but I think the emphasis on adaptation and resilience is exciting this year. I think that has been around in previous climate weeks, but I think this year it feels that people are recognizing that adaptation and resilience are enablers to broader progress on mitigation and decarbonization and not a distraction.
Mm.
And I think that we have to all be in this together. And I think we're not fighting for two different aims here. And so it's been inspiring to see that everyone has a different slice of this tough challenge, but that we're all working together to figure out how we both mitigate, but also buy time and adapt to what's come.
I'd agree that adaptation resilience are themes that seem to be growing in popularity in
Yeah.
these circles. I am a bit worried that they're being used as a way to try and obfuscate what's actually happening, right? If you
Mm.
talk about resilience, you talk in the language that this current administration likes,
Mm.
then maybe you'll avoid getting targeted by
Mm.
a US prosecutor or something, or
Yeah.
maybe it'll be easy to raise funds from a very politically conscious investment group. So I like the fact that we're focused on adaptation as long as we're actually focusing on actual adaptation, preparing ourselves, protecting ourselves from climate risks, rather than using it to kind of cover a whole range of stuff that isn't actually adaptation resilience, like people trying to push forward still mitigation projects, which are important, but under the guise of adaptation, and that might distract.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, and there's obviously similar lens about security and
Mm-hmm.
value creation. Yeah, so I've seen a lot of the terms there. I have a slightly different take on it, which might be interesting. I think that especially the work that I'm doing with the National Commission on Climate and Workforce Health, we're focused on helping employers overall recognize and manage and mitigate the climate-driven risk to their workforce. And I think what's unique about this kind of work, and there's other pockets of this, of course, too, is it is reliant on people who don't have the term climate or sustainability in their job title.
Mm.
And we need to bring in people, and we are bringing in people from HR, risk, lots of different functions. And so I think I agree with you there that there is a risk in obfuscation or in sort of putting a resilience veneer over programs that may have been called something different last year or earlier this year even. But what I think is exciting is that it is allowing, I think it is allowing folks to just rethink how do you reach audiences where they're at around this work. I forget who coined this phrase, but essentially every job is a climate job.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear that as not, and that every job needs the title climate in it, but it's that every job and every role will be affected by what is happening
Yeah.
around climate change. And I don't think that your average leader needs to transform how they think about their role, but they need to recognize these things are happening. And so I think reframing some of these challenges in a different way, I don't think is a bad thing as long as people realize they have a role to play in solving them.
Yes, if you can communicate it in a way that kind of lodges in the brain of someone who's in a particular job, particular role, it's hard sometimes if you want to impose your own
Yep.
view of the world, your own view of why adaptation is important. If you actually speak in their language, then yes, maybe it will more naturally become part of their day to day.
Exactly.
Let's take a step back then and
Sure.
talk about the National Commission. Can you explain what it is? And I know you've been doing some events with them this week as well, so it'd be great to hear about what's been going on there.
Sure. Yeah. So the National Commission on Climate and Workforce Health, where I serve as program director, is an initiative of the Health Action Alliance, which is a broad coalition of businesses focused on furthering public health. We're supported by fantastic partners like Mercer, Elevance Health, and the Hartford, the De Beaumont Foundation as well. And with what is unique about our work is we're really trying to activate employers overall, private sector employers, public sector employers, to recognize that climate change shows up as health and workforce impacts more than people think it does. There is, and obviously, lots of folks on your show talk about climate risk and how we need to prepare for that. Generally, in all these climate risk or resilience conversations, the human health component is it's underemphasized in it. And ultimately, we care about climate change because it affects our health. It might affect our health directly through heat stroke or heat stress. It might affect our health indirectly if a bridge gets swept out and we can't go seek health care after a
Mm.
storm or something like that. But we ultimately care about these things because they affect ourselves and our families and our communities. And so, at the National Commission, we're focused on engaging the tens of thousands of employers in the U.S. that employ about 170 million people at a given time to recognize that they have a vested interest in protecting their workers. That is their biggest asset on their balance sheet, and those workers are continually being impacted via extreme heat and storms and weather. Vector-borne disease is a topic that is coming up more and more. And so we focus on education campaigns, engaging employers on all these topics. An example of that is this week we hosted 2 workforce resilience labs at Mercer in Midtown Manhattan, focused on bringing in both experts and employers to really map out these risks. And what I think is so exciting about what we did is we were bringing folks in the room who were not in New York for Climate Week.
Oh.
They were like, it's busy. There's Secret Service in town because the president's here and whatnot.
They had no idea why.
They didn't know. They know it was busy. And someone said to me, well, New York is always busy. And that just clicked with me as that's so exciting that we're bringing in people into this conversation about resilience, about adaptation, about health, but are not here. They're doing that as part of their role in HR or in benefits. We had folks from HR, risk, design, operations, all these different functions across employers thinking about how does heat, for instance, show up as a direct impact, an indirect impact on people, but then how does that translate to a workforce or employer impact? But more importantly, what are the solutions around that? And how do you make a business case to leadership at an organization to understand and manage these issues? So really successful events. We're going to take this blueprint we did today, continue to share the lessons of it, but hold more of these workforce resilience labs in the months and years ahead.
And when you say labs, does this mean you're actually trying to create some ideas that can go out back to these companies where these folks from HR and risk are coming from, so they can kind of nurture them, and then you can all come back and say, hey, what worked, what didn't work? Because lab has a certain terminology.
It does. Yes, I would say, we did not have a panel at ours, and I love panels, and I learned a lot at panels this week. But I think ultimately in this space of workforce health, we actually sort of know what works. There's of course innovations happening in the wearable space and the technology space, but ultimately, we have the science and the clinical expertise to know how you prevent people from getting sick or dying from extreme heat, for instance. The problem is that those solutions and that sort of governance and the data is not being scaled in the way where those solutions are being implemented at scale. And so, yes, we had a very lab-type workshop environment, a lot of post-it notes of a lot of different colors on a lot of different posters.
That's fun.
It was great. It was good. And we had great feedback from folks who obviously love to learn from experts. And we had experts from the National Commission on Climate and Workforce Health in the room. But it was a very collaborative, interactive experience. And I think that really helps folks take away these lessons and bring them back to their organizations.
And are there any trends in terms of which organizations are most likely to engage with you at the National Commission? Is it somewhat self-selecting? Are there any surprises there about what companies or organizations are saying, hey, we actually really need some help on this?
Yeah, I would think about that in 2 ways. So first, and I mentioned the folks that support our work, Mercer, Elevance Health, and the Hartford. And I think it's insightful there. Mercer is a large health and benefits consulting firm and broker, and Elevance Health and the Hartford are insurance companies. And I think what's ultimately, insurance companies and the folks that work with them, like Mercer, are there to understand risk. And I think when these organizations are stepping up and saying there is a health risk that we are not considering as an outcome or of climate change or because of climate change, that to me is those are the kind of organizations which are saying we need to raise awareness of climate and health as a business issue in order for thousands and thousands of employers that affect millions of employees, employ millions of employees, to do something about this. So I think that's sort of our commission and our leadership on there. I'd also say there's organizations both that have predominantly outdoor workers. We had someone at our sessions who works for a sort of a forestry company, thinking about, we have folks working literally working in extreme weather and helping manage these, and working in extreme heat and helping their workers understand and manage those impacts too.
Yeah, I want to double down on this topic of heat because that's something that's being picked up a lot by not just policymakers, but also by investors as well. There's a lot of funds now who are thinking about extreme heat as a topic they know they should tackle or founders should tackle with new technologies, wearables, etc. Yep. And in the health space as well, we've got to think about how heat is going to affect the transportation of drugs, how it's going to affect productivity. There was a World Economic Forum report that recently came out actually talking about the $12.5 trillion hit to global GDP that can happen from climate health impacts out to 2050. And a big part of that, kind of surprising to me, was yes, additional treatments will be needed because people were getting sick more because of heat exhaustion, because of vector-borne diseases. But 600 billion or something was going to be lost worker productivity, again, largely because of heat. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about heat risks and particularly how it affects productivity, business bottom lines, and maybe some of the less obvious ways heat can affect the economy.
Yes, that new report is great for the World Economic Forum and some other partners. And I think, so yes, heat is the biggest silent killer. It is at least in the U.S. and I believe in most places around the world too, contributes to more injuries and deaths than all other climate risks combined. And so extreme heat is a huge a huge issue and something that's just not as visible. Of course, there are visible impacts of extreme heat, but not like a hurricane or a tornado or a flood. And so, yeah, it shows up for employers in lots of different ways. And this is one of the sort of main activities we did with our sessions earlier this week is focusing on, extreme heat can have direct impact on as in terms of heat stress or heat stroke, and physically can affect your cardiovascular health in the moment. And that is exacerbated for folks that have pre-existing conditions, for women who are pregnant, and there's lots of different categories where extreme heat is even worse and more impactful. Um, those show up in terms of, yes, you mentioned productivity there. We had a couple participants in the room that just said, people just don't show up to work after a couple days. They're exhausted after this. And of course, there's different rules and whatnot in terms of hourly workers or in terms of salaried workers about that. But ultimately, heat hurts you, and even if you are okay to get up and go somewhere, after a couple days of it, it can really be debilitating. Um, uh, and someone else in our sessions this week, this is in my mind because we had employers talk about this, just talked about aggression. And heat is tied to folks being aggressive, and it sort of sparks more conflict, both actually at a global scale, but at a micro scale in a workplace as well. But the most common example that I hear about sort of illustrating not the direct effects of extreme heat is if someone's a little delirious or something like that. If I'm on my laptop, that might be okay. But if I'm on a ladder, if I'm operating heavy machinery, if I have other people around me under or near that heavy machinery, that's very dangerous. And ultimately, there is not a lot of understanding about. I should say, we know the science behind it. Your average individual does not understand how extreme heat affects them and their limits. And so that's what makes it so dangerous. I think up to 70% of heat-related injury and death happen on the first week of work for most workers. And so, yeah, so there's a whole acclimatization and education piece here as well. Just the last thing I'll say on this, yes, there are so many fascinating technology startups, both in terms of hard technology and hardware and wearables to help keep folks cool. But there's also an increasing conversation around the data needed to understand heat risk and the urban heat island effect and wind speed. We're sitting in very muggy New York City today, and how humidity plays a role in that. And so there's a lot of interesting things out there. But I think all those technologies will need to be scalable and implemented in a way where they're reaching the right people at organizations to make decisions to protect workers.
And the communication and education is such an important part of that because, yes, you talk about humidity. Sometimes you'll see the weather forecast saying, oh, it's going to be in the mid-70s, that's going to be fine. But actually, if you check the humidity, you realize that's going to have a multiplier effect on your discomfort levels.
Exactly.
And some people don't get that.
Exactly. Just a couple quick things on there as well. We work, a lot of the employers that are interested in the work of the National Commission on Climate and Workforce Health may not have a large percentage of outdoor workers, but extreme heat can still impact people, obviously on their commute when they're outside, but it impacts mental health as well. There's a lot of, there's people that talk about if you're in Phoenix or Florida or increasingly New York City or the Pacific Northwest, you can't go outside for lots of hours of the day. Like you have to get up before the sun comes out or go out after the sun comes out. And that can really affect mental health to be cooped up all day in air conditioned rooms. There's also a huge element of financial stress here. Energy prices in the US are going up and electricity prices are going up. And more companies are thinking about how can I offer subsidies for heat pumps or for air conditioning, and really thinking about that is a huge financial burden on people to keep themselves cool, which is a safety issue. So lots of interesting things happening in the space as it gets hotter.
And besides tech and education, I'm wondering what sort of workplace policies could be useful here. And also thinking about it out loud, some of those policies might be kind of antithetical to the kind of capitalist ideal of maximizing your efficiency, because in other cultures, other countries where it's very hot, it's been very hot for generations, there's a culture of taking longer lunches, taking breaks, frequent breaks to cool down, working different schedules. Those policies may actually be kind of light touch in terms of the impact on individuals, but for companies it might be very disruptive. So can you tell about the policy side, like what employers can do on that front?
Yeah. So you're right that people have been dealing with heat for a long time. Extreme heat is not a new thing, but the challenge is that it's happening in more places more frequently, and the people who it's affecting don't know about it, and we're learning about it. And so, yeah, what we've seen is sort of the basics is rest, shade, and hydration for outdoor workers, especially. And again, that's not rocket science itself, but doing it in a way, and there's a lot of research out there on this that other folks are more an expert than I am on, is doing that in a way that maintains productivity in the short term, but more importantly, keeps workers healthy in the longer term. And I think ultimately here, if we're going to talk about some of these challenging questions of capitalism, it's all around short versus long-term incentives.
Mm.
And I think, yes, day in and day out, if you need to get a project done, you're probably incentivized to have your team or even yourself work very hard in the heat. But ultimately, extreme heat can compound these issues over time. And we use with a lot of our the employers we work with tools like there's a tool called the Climate Health Cost Forecaster, which helps map out how will extreme heat affect your healthcare costs for an employer over a 1 to 10 year period. And so, that's not going to help you make a scheduling decision necessarily in the moment, but it'll help you for next summer think about how can we rethink how many people we have on our team, where are they working, their schedules, the PPE we have for them, those kinds of policies, having a heat response policy, having a heat wave policy when it does get really hot for multiple days on end. We think that those longer term cost drivers can be an incentive to help employers and managers understand how do you change a few things around the edges here to really protect workers while maintaining productivity and output.
One conversation that stuck with me from earlier this week regarded the financial institutions investing in adaptation resilience. And this one panelist said, we've got to get comfortable with the fact it's going to be short-term, costly, long-term, cheaper.
Yep.
And actually there will be a lot of like upfront capex and maybe a lot of upfront disruption that has to happen. But as you said, when you do these calculations, like for healthcare costs, you can see over the long term that there is going to be a net benefit to your bottom line, to the health of your workers, to retention of employees as well, one imagines. But I think that is still a kind of a hump we have to get over for a bunch of industries. And I'm not entirely sure what's going to change that. I do worry that it's going to be more instances of like very long duration heat waves that cause real issues in major states in the US where actually their economy relies on outdoor workers and suddenly there's a shutdown and suddenly politicians are like, oh goodness, we have to do something about this. That's my worry. That's actually going to be the physical reality of climate change that's going to push it rather than actually us knowing in advance these things are going to happen and putting stuff in place now.
Yeah. No, I think it's a combination of those two things where I think ultimately action is spurred when people realize how bad it can get. And of course, I don't wish it was that way. No one does, but that's, I think, human nature a little bit there. I think what we're trying to do and what a lot of folks in the adaptation and resilience space are doing, and I think, Louis, you do a great job of this through this podcast and through Climate Proof in general, is just showing that there is a longer term risk to all this. And in general, most organizations, institutions, governments, individuals are probably underestimating the things they need to do right now in order to be resilient for the future and to adapt to a changing world. And so I think there's a moment of how do we educate people about these events as they happen after the summer, huge floods and extreme weather and heat across the U.S. and of course internationally as well. But really mapping out and trying to educate decision makers that these things are going to keep happening. And this winter, for instance, it is very important for you to think about how should a similar year next year or a worse year next year affect your planning and affect how you the policies you might build this winter might even where you develop new facilities or what kind of technologies you put in those or air filtration if you're near an area that is experiencing more wildfire events. And so I think there is a sort of a physical piece of saying, look at what's happening. And the second is saying, here's some data that will show you how it might hurt your workers and your operations and your supply chain more going forward. And these are the investments now to help to mitigate those risks going forward.
Well, keep ringing that bell, keep banging that drum with the National Commission. Thanks for all the work you're doing with them. And thanks for being in today, David.
Of course. Thank you, Louis, for all you're doing.